There's a handful of names in Vana'diel who are synonymous with their profession, those who have gained such a degree of fame and reveration that they are what the masses instantly associate with their term. Zeid can count himself among these select few. To the people of Bastok, and beyond since the end of the Crystal War, Zeid is the quintessential Dark Knight, the one who brought the art back from the brink of extinction from its glory days when the Galka inhabited the Altelpa Desert. Zeid's skills as a Dark Knight are legendary, a legend which exploded when he defeated the Shadow Lord in single combat, effectively bringing an end to the Crystal War. Beyond his legend as a hero, precious little is known about the person behind it. To all who cross paths with him, Zeid is reported to be notoriously difficult to decipher. Since one is unlikely going to get the full story from the mouth of the man himself, secondary source accounts are called for. From the stories told by those who knew Zeid, a rough picture can be assembled. Much of Zeid's early years will likely never be accounted for, but we do know that in his impressionable years he received a martial education in the arts of war and philosophy. Taught by the great Galkan elders Were, Gumba, Ogbi, and even the Talekeeper Algren himself, Zeid displayed great aptitude and promise. It also seems that Zeid had something of a prideful streak and was rather hot-headed, traits which resulted in him being soundly beaten by his swordmaster Were when Zeid foolishly sought to duel him to prove himself as better. Noticing his potential and knowing that he needed to harness it, Were and Algren taught Zeid in the ways of the Dark Knights, thinking that his passion could be harnessed in a positive direction for the good of others, rather than be left to run unfettered and amok. Following his intense training as a Dark Knight, Zeid emerged as a swordsman of incredible skill to match his mentor at last. He was presented with a specially forged suit of dark steel armor by the Galkan blacksmith Gerwitz, armor fashioned in the image of the Dark Knights of old, an armor set that now makes him immediately identifiable. The first primary account of Zeid appears in the military history of Bastok. In 855 CE, Zeid enlisted in the Republican army with a newly formed 13th Regiment under the name Warcloud. This regiment was distinct in that it was the first regiment in the army comprised entirely of Galkan soldiers. Although it counted formidable warriors within its ranks, the truth is that the regiment was founded as a propaganda stunt meant to try and mend race relations between Galka and Humes. Relations which had deteriorated considerably ever since the Talekeeper Algren, the Galkan community leader and one of Zeid's mentors, had been presumed killed in action while on an expedition to the Northlands. Zeid's presence in the regiment as one of its commanding officers was a source of pride for Bastokers, who saw in him a potential successor to Algren. As if to underline its symbolism, the first expedition the 13th Regiment was sent on was to succeed where Algren's mission had fallen short, and investigate word of the Dark Kindred forming an alliance between the Beastmen races in preparation for a war. The 13th Regiment was ambushed by the Kindred demons when they wandered too close to Castles of Isle for their comfort. Hopelessly outnumbered by the demons, the 13th Regiment signalled for reinforcements from a nearby regiment of Hume soldiers. Although they received the signal, when the relief force arrived, they saw the beleaguered Galkan regiment, and rather than rush to their aid, prejudice got the better of them, and they left the Galka to their fate. It was an absolute massacre, a pitched battle of which Zeid was the only survivor. Seeing his brethren slaughtered when they could have been saved, pushed Zeid over the precipice all Dark Knights precariously stride. Taking a knife to his own face, Zeid carved the sigil of the 13th Regiment into his forehead, a permanent reminder of the new mission he set himself: vengeance. All the morality and self-control over his rage and passion, instilled in him by his training as a Dark Knight, completely shattered. The prejudice and folly of the Humes had created an absolute monster. Taking on the new name of Darksteel Hurricane, Zeid began a merciless one-man war against the Humes responsible for the decision to abandon his comrades. Zeid's killings were unbelievably brutal, but they all had one thread of commonality in that each victim had the sigil of the 13th Regiment carved into their faces. Zeid showed absolutely no mercy in his methods, but his methods were not of madness, they had been well planned. Knowing that he would be recognized by his signature armor, Zeid made sure to strike his targets when they left the safety of Bastok. Even if they were accompanied by a small army of soldiers, it mattered not. Because of his vitriolic rage, his powers as a Dark Knight had grown to an incredible degree. He crushed anyone he fought, innocent or not. At this point, he did not care. With each high-profile murder, the legend of the Ghost of Retribution grew. Darksteel Hurricane became an infamous figure of terrorism and murder. Nobody knew for what reason the vigilante killed, and why he killed who he did. The fate of the 13th Regiment had been falsified by those who made the decision to abandon them, because to admit the truth of what actually happened would certainly cause a Galkan revolution. Yet as Hume after Hume fell to his blade, Zeid felt more and more of his self fall away. Vitriol burns bright, but it also burns away quickly. With the last of his targets murdered, Zeid returned to where it all began, and wandered as a shell of his former self, a completely broken man. He had lost everything. He had no purpose, nowhere to go, and nobody to turn to. Then came a pivotal moment in Zeid's story. He was approached by a noble of the kindred, Marquis Aemon. Greeting him as if they were kin, which in his eyes Zeid had practically become on account of his actions, Aemon asked as to why Zeid had stopped his killing spree. Zeid had no means of which to respond. He was utterly broken. Who remained in his mortal body? The Dark Knight Zeid, the proud soldier Warcloud, or the mass murderer Darksteel Hurricane? Noticing his state of mind, Aemon saw an opportunity to capitalize. He had plans for the soul that stood before him. Aemon offered him an escape. He would be granted powers akin to his master, the Shadow Lord, if only he would complete his fall and fully succumb to the darkness within. A sadistic twist of fate, since Zeid's mentor Algren had already been taken on the same path, and if he accepted, he would be reunited with him, and have a renewed purpose. Before he could entice Zeid to his side, Aemon was interrupted by the arrival of Clara Besta, captain of the Mithril Musketeers. Clara had noticed the correlation between the victims of Darksteel Hurricane and had ventured north in an attempt to bring Zeid in. However, when she saw the scene in front of her, Clara realized the truth as to what had happened. Aemon had been the one responsible for luring the 13th Regiment towards Castle Sval, the one who had given the order to keep Zeid alive, purely because he could be used as a powerful weapon against Bastok. Worse still, Aemon answered only to the Shadow Lord himself, who had been Zeid's mentor before he fell, and therefore he knew exactly how to break him. Before she could charge Aemon, the demon summoned the flames of the underworld to surround himself and his captive. Zeid staggered forward, consigned to his fall into darkness. Clara shouted at him to stop, and her words somehow stopped him in his tracks. He could not understand why he had stopped though. As Aemon spoke into his ear, he seemed to speak nothing but sense. Zeid had no reason to trust this Hume, but something was holding him back. What was this feeling? How could he even feel anymore after all that had happened to him? A furious battle was raging inside Zeid's head as the two personas he had came clashing together in a fight for his very soul. Zeid, the noble Dark Knight and son of Bastok, and Darksteel Hurricane, the ignoble Dark Knight and the feral killer. He fell to his knees, screaming as all the emotion and the weight of his actions crushed him. Finally, Clara's voice won out and brought him back to his senses. Zeid scrambled towards her and was pulled through the fire. Furious, Aemon threw the thrallstone he intended for Zeid after him. He would not give up his prize so easily. Clara saw it at the last moment, and with a single strike of her sword smashed it into pieces. Overwhelmed by the ordeal herself, Clara sank to her knees, exhausted but ultimately victorious. A puzzled Zeid looked over at her and realized what the feeling that saved him from Eamon's clutches was. Compassion. Compassion is what his elders had instilled in him during his training, as it was something a Dark Knight was meant to harbor close to their soul to prevent themselves from falling. This was the first genuine compassion anyone had shown Zeid for years, and its expression is what brought him back from the very brink. From this moment on, Zeid owed Clara his life, and the two reached an understanding. Clara brought Zeid back to Bastok, and using her influence as a musketeer captain, concealed the truth of Zeid's absence by stating that he had been training after his regiment was killed in action. In exchange, Zeid renewed his allegiance to Bastok, but above all to Clara herself, who had promoted Zeid to the ranks of the Mithril Musketeers, where he would be most useful and where she could also keep an eye on him. Zeid was fortunate that his distinctive armor concealed the scar on his forehead, and since people were accustomed to seeing him in the armor, nobody ever questioned why he never took his helmet off in public. For the next 6 years, Zeid formed a loose companionship with the other musketeers. Among them was Volker, nephew of Clara's predecessor Ulrich, Nikolaus, a scholar and graduate of the Schultz School, and a fellow Gauker, a trainee Dark Knight called 5 Moons, who Zeid lent his experience to. The team functioned well together, but Zeid was very careful to not let anyone other than Captain Clara get remotely close to him, and it became evident to all that the two had some history together, but what it was exactly they did not know. At the outbreak of the Crystal War, Zeid served with distinction in the defense of Bastok, but his first real task involved him confronting a ghost of the past. Tensions between Hume and Gauker had flared up again. During wartime, one of Zeid's own comrades, 5 Moons, suddenly became the head of a revolution against the Hume-dominated government, and began demanding that people call him by his Gauken name, Galag. Upon probing this sudden change of heart, Zeid discovered that Galag had come across a book which detailed the exploits of Darksteel Hurricane. Understandably, Zeid was not impressed, and took it upon himself to subdue Galag and arrest him for treason. This was the first time in 6 years that Zeid had been made to confront the reality of his past head-on, from a man he considered a student to himself nonetheless. Still, Zeid was instrumental in securing Galag's release. Probably because he did not want his comrade to go down the same path he did, he knew that the best way to avoid that was to show compassion. Zeid's display was enough to unify the fragmented Republic, enough for it to stand against a heavy assault from the Quadav, who had caught wind of the chaos in Bastok and sought to take advantage of the situation. Hume and Gauker fought alongside one another in defense of a single homeland. Even Zeid's mentors, Gumba and Were, took to the battlefield. The sight of the unified Mithril Musketeers was an emboldening sight for the people, when hope was needed more than ever. The Battle of Bastok was the turning point for the Republic's fortunes in the war, as from that point on they went solely on the offensive, pushing back and containing the Quadav to the Pashau marshlands. Before they could turn their attention northward to join the other allied forces in the final offensive, something disastrous occurred. The second pivotal moment of Zeid's story came when he and Clara were summoned to the President's office to accept the reinstation of the Musketeers as the personal guard to President Prien. Out of nowhere, and to the complete bewilderment of Zeid, Captain Clara drew her sword on the President and said that she was going to kill him. Instinctively, Zeid made to stop her, but Clara invoked the promise that Zeid had made to her to remain ever obedient, ever since she saved his life, and he stood down. Not for the first time in his life, two forces in Zeid's mind clashed. Who did he stand with? The woman who saved his life, or the country they both served? Volker had no such reservations though. He charged into the office to restrain his captain, but before he could properly act, he was struck down, getting his distinctive facial scar in the process. As Clara was about to deliver the final blow to the President, Zeid finally leapt into action, parrying the killing strike. He could not comprehend why the captain he had served under and respected for 6 years was acting in such a manner. Something was definitely wrong. When reinforcements arrived, Zeid threw himself between Clara and Gallag. Putting his Herculean Dark Knight strength to great use, he was able to prevent the two from fighting, something which would have certainly resulted in more than one casualty. Clara disengaged and made to flee, but not before saying something which instantly raised Zeid's suspicions. Clara told Zeid that the next time they met, it would not be her that stood before him. Then, it hit him. Zeid knew where Clara was going, and he knew what he needed to do. Zeid hastened to the Northlands to chase down Clara with his comrades in pursuit of them both. The final Allied offensive on Zarkabad had begun, so the fight the Mithril Musketeers had to navigate was fierce, but they eventually found Zeid at the exact spot where his comrades lost their lives all those years ago. With the apparent betrayal of their captain, Zeid knew that he could no longer conceal the truth from his fellows. He took off his helm and at long last revealed himself to be Darksteel Hurricane. Nikolaus and Gallag could not believe what they were seeing. The man they both revered and considered a comrade had in fact once been a notorious mass murderer. Zeid explained the entirety of his side of the story, that the 13th Regiment had been betrayed and left to face their demise alone, that their deaths had been covered up by corrupt officials who sought to prevent an uprising if the truth ever got out, and that Darksteel Hurricane had indeed been brought to justice by their captain. His service to the nation he once fought was his penance. With Nikolaus and Gallag still reeling from all of these revelations, Zeid told them of his intentions in coming north. Zeid suspected that 6 years ago, when Clara had saved him from Marquis Aemon, shards of the Thrallstone the demon had meant for him had embedded themselves in Clara when she stood between them both. Because of that shard, Clara had been subject to Aemon's control whenever it was convenient for him, but she was not Aemon's true target. It was still Zeid. Aemon was not going to let his prize go, and Clara being brought to Castle's Val was the perfect way to bring Zeid back to him, as he knew that his honour and loyalty to her would compel him. Zeid was going to oblige him. He was going straight to Aemon, to kill him and free Clara from his possession. None among the musketeers were content with a plan, but as it stood, in their situation, it was the only plan they had. Rendezvousing with Volker at Castle's Val, and with the majority of the Beastman army contained in Zarkabad by the Allied forces, the musketeers fought their way beyond the Baileys. Stopping briefly to formulate their plan, Zeid felt an ominously familiar presence. He knew it had to be Aemon. He had been watching their progress, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sure enough, right on cue, Aemon conjured a portal and appeared before them. Addressing Zeid in his nonchalant and patronizing manner, Aemon offered him terms for the release of Clara. He would need to surrender himself in her stead. It seemed that Zeid's suspicions were correct. Aemon had never given up on securing such a promising soldier, a Dark Knight who had a proven potential for unprecedented violence and rage. However, it seemed that Aemon had even greater ambitions than simply recruiting a soldier. He saw in Zeid the potential for usurping his master, the Shadow Lord. If Zeid destroyed the Shadow Lord and Aemon controlled Zeid beyond that point, then by proxy he would also rule over the Beastmen entirely. To force their hand, Aemon called for backup, and since the musketeers had been fixated on him, they were all surrounded before they could act. Zeid broke the stalemate by resolving to go with Aemon to the throne room of the castle, where Aemon said someone who longed to meet his acquaintance awaited them. Zeid found himself facing the imposing figure of the Shadow Lord, and although he did not know it yet, he was in fact meeting his mentor Algren for the first time in over a decade. Aemon offered the potential to his master, and, knowing who Zeid was from his previous life, the Shadow Lord had no reservation in obliging him. Raising Zeid into the air with ease, he began infusing his soul with a power it had lost when Darksteel Hurricane perished. Before he could complete the process, the musketeers charged into the room and prepared for battle. Surprised at their arrival, the Shadow Lord dropped Zeid and made to leave. He could have easily crushed the musketeers that stood before him, but in his arrogance, he considered them well below being worthy of his effort or attention. The musketeers had finally backed Eamon into a corner. They just needed to find his Thrallstone and destroy it. Doing so would free Clara. Eamon was unconcerned at Volker's threats, and to the horror of the musketeer, he commanded Zeid to rise and kill his comrade. The two stared each other down for a tense moment as Eamon laughed in his success. Volker was absolutely no match for Zeid, let alone Zeid with his rage fully unfettered. Eamon had made a critical mistake though, one which would cost him dearly. With his great sword already drawn, Eamon was caught completely off guard when Zeid turned from Volker to him and charged. Only just parrying the attack at the last moment, Eamon was dumbstruck. How had his plan failed? Zeid enlightened him. Rage and despair were not what fueled a Dark Knight's powers. Eamon's hubris had overlooked that which Zeid was taught long ago. The true source of a Dark Knight's power was passion, the desire to protect others by shouldering the weight of darkness without breaking. Eamon's mistake had amplified Zeid's powers into overdrive, but his experiences and the compassion he had been shown not only by his captain, but now by his comrades, had shielded his soul from breaking. Eamon panicked. He knew that he was outmatched, thinking on the spot he possessed Clara, knowing that Zeid would have to hold himself back lest he killed her. Spotting his move too late, Volker was sent flying by Clara and knocked out cold. This would be a fight between Zeid and Clara. It was time he returned the favour in saving her life. Zeid took a defensive stance and tried to disarm Eamon, but sure enough, his holding back only resulted in him being disarmed. As Eamon drew Clara's sword arm back to finish him off, Clara's arm seized up. It was not responding to his commands. Clara was fighting back. This was the exact opening Zeid needed. The Thrallstone was exposed. Tapping into his new power, Zeid created an astral version of himself, complete with greatsword in hand, and sent it right at the stone. The shade struck true and shattered the stone, killing Eamon with it. Zeid was terrified his gambit had not worked, but as Clara opened her eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt for a long time: relief. The outcome of this mission was always uncertain, but against unprecedented odds, the Mithril Musketeers had gone into the very heart of their enemy's castle and snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Clara could barely speak, but what words she could muster were ones of gratitude. The Musketeers were truly reunited as a unit once again. Carrying Clara, the Musketeers made for Bastok. Before Zeid could leave the throne room with her though, the door shut on him, and he heard the booming voice of the Shadow Lord. It seemed he wanted the last word. Then, something he said sent a chill down Zeid's spine. Where there is light, there will always be shadow. For so long hatred and rage fester in the hearts of Altana's children, ere will my power grow. Zeid had heard something very similar before, from one of his mentors when he was a youth in the early days of his training. It had been over a decade, but the memory was still vivid. It had been one of Ralgrim's first lessons. Ralgrim, but he had been killed in action, outside this very castle. Realizing the horrible truth, Zeid put everything together, and he understood the Shadow Lord's interest in him at last. He saw himself in Zeid, as they had been on alike paths up until this point. Their destinies now diverged, with the events of this day setting them apart. The Tailkeeper of the Galka had fallen, in a manner that Zeid came dangerously close to doing so. And here he was now, his warped mentor Algren, completely unrecognizable, goading his student because he had succeeded where he had failed, in saving a loved one. With all doubt around the Mithril Musketeers dispelled, Zeid was made the temporary captain of the unit, to no objection. Barely had they returned from Zarkabad when they were dispatched back to the region for the final assault on Castle Zval. This set the stage for the third pivotal moment of Zeid's story, the day which would seal his name in legend across the continent. Zeid defeated the Shadow Lord and ended the Crystal War. He knew that the Shadow Lord's identity, being revealed as the Tailkeeper of the Galka, would turn all of the enlightened races against them. Whether his motivations were justified or not, Ralgrim's actions would never be forgiven by the people who had lost so much to him, so it fell upon the student to defeat his master. The day would not be won without major allied losses though. With the allied forces right on the cusp of breaching Castle Zval, the Shadow Lord himself took to the battlefield. Until this point in the Crystal War, the only ones who had set eyes on the Shadow Lord had been the Mithril Musketeers, but none had actually seen him in battle. They were about to. Wielding dark magic and his colossal blade the Nightfall in hand, the Shadow Lord laid utter waste to the vanguard of the allied forces, routing them into a retreat when victory seemed within grasp. Ralgrim had been the strongest swordsman among the Galka, and his skills in combat, strengthened now by his towering figure, were put to devastating use. None other than Zeid hoped to stand a chance against him. He cut through the allied lines like a hot knife, smiting wounded and fleeing soldiers with no mercy whatsoever. Zeid was only able to stand his ground by unleashing the full extent of his powers which had been mistakenly brought to the peak by the very Shadow Lord he now fought. Zeid was accompanied in battle by Volker, who had been the only one Zeid had confided in as to the true identity of their foe. After an intense battle, Zeid struck the Shadow Lord down. His and Volker's names spread across the land as legends in their lifetimes. But it was a hollow victory for Zeid. With the retirement of Clara following her ordeal, the clamour for Zeid to succeed her as the captain of the Mithril Musketeers was almost universal, but he declined the position, giving it instead to Volker. He then left Bastok with no intention of ever returning, to the bewilderment of all. For the next 2 decades, Zeid became a wandering knight, travelling from place to place, sometimes choosing seclusion from society entirely for years at a time. The Crystal War had been won, and the Tailkeeper had been put to rest, but Zeid's soul weighed heavy with the weight of his own sin. For the Galka, killing the Tailkeeper, the spiritual leader and collective memory of the entire Galkan race, was a serious taboo. It mattered not that Ralgrim had fallen into shadow and forsaken his mortal Galkan form. The fact remained that even as the Shadow Lord, he retained the gifts of the Tailkeeper. It was exactly how he was able to almost contort Zeid into his own image with his knowledge. As such, Zeid was unable to return to life among his brethren, having committed such a transgression. Zeid's reasoning extended beyond a single taboo though. He knew that, in time, a new Tailkeeper would be reincarnated. This child would be the hope of the future of peaceful coexistence finally realized. Zeid returning to society with the sins of his past in tow, and given that they represented the antithesis of this promised future, simply would not stand. After all, he had seen what extremes people would go to when they idolized his crimes, as he had with Galag. To have all Galka become aware of this fact was unthinkable. Ironically, after all that he had done, the responsibilities of the Tailkeeper had fallen to him. Be the pillar of his people while keeping a wide berth of stunting genuine progress by staying out of its way. However, coexistence was a two-way avenue, as Bastokan history had demonstrated, and this brings us to the last pivotal chapter in the Dark Knight story. Volker had been told by Zeid who the Shadow Lord had once been, but he had not been told who brought Ralgrim to such a state. When Volker discovered the truth, it broke his resolve to lead into a better future, as his own uncle Ulrich had been responsible for Ralgrim's fall into darkness. Infuriated at Volker's inertia and inability, Zeid challenged him to a duel at the very place their fates had diverged at the end of the Crystal War, Castle Zval. Volker came to Zeid and demanded to know why he would not just take the captaincy from him. Zeid was furious at this gesture, To him, Volker had not grasped why Zeid had not done so in the first place. The status of musketeer captain mattered not to Zeid. What mattered was that the life of Algren had not been for naught. If Volker, the figurehead of Humes, could not rise above his family legacy of prejudice and weakness to work with the new Tailkeeper, then there was truly no hope for the future. Zeid intended to get this point across, and not for the first time in his life, he drew his sword on Volker and the two clashed. Volker, with the aid of an adventurer, was able to best Zeid. The outcome of the battle mattered not to him. Provided the lesson had been conveyed, he was content. Volker had finally come to understand Zeid. He alone could not set an example which would lead the people of Bastok to the future. Coexistence required that differences at last be put aside. Zeid's actions in service of Bastok and against it rendered him unable to reconcile and bridge the gap between Hume and Galka, which often threatened to destroy the nation. His time had come, and with this final duty, it had gone. If he returned to Bastok now, it would undo all of the progress that had been made since he left 20 years ago. Volker had the prime opportunity to prove to his people that he was a man superior to his uncle, whose prejudice and apathy had brought about the rise of the Shadow Lord and all the misery which followed. He had the opportunity to work with the young Tailkeeper, the reincarnated Gumba. The promise of a better future was within reach. Volker just needed reminding of Zeid's story, of his sacrifices, to reach out and finally grasp it. Content with Volker's leadership, Zeid's duty to Bastok was finished. He returned to his life as a wandering Dark Knight, but resolved to not distance himself from the world whenever peril struck. Adventurers who seek training in the ways of the Dark Knights will inevitably cross paths with Zeid, and when they do, they may now hopefully better understand the one who came closer to the abyss without falling than anyone else before, all for the sake of companionship.